I'm going to read you a true story. My first day in Japan. In November 1959, when I was 17, I went to Japan for a month and lived with two Japanese families, one in the suburb of Tokyo, the other in Kobe. I had graduated from high school the previous June and would start college the following year. I was one of 22 students in the first run of the International School of America, an educational experiment that took us and 6 faculty members around the world for 8.5 months, housing us with native families in the countries we visited while we attended classes on subjects relevant to our travels. After an introductory 4 weeks in the U.S. mainland and one in Hawaii, we flew to Tokyo, our first overseas destination. The flight seemed endless on a propeller plane that made stops on Midway and Wake Islands before landing in the gray, wet dawn of the 1st of November, a Sunday. We missed Halloween, which vanished when we crossed the international date line. The plan was to meet our host families in a central location, spend the rest of the weekend with them, and regroup on Monday morning in a classroom at Keio University, Tokyo's oldest and one of its most prestigious institutions of higher education. To prepare for this adventure, we had been assigned books to read: Ruth Benedict's classic analysis of the Japanese psyche and culture, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword; Ichiro Kawasaki's delightful The Japanese Are Like That; The Book of Tea by Kakuzo Okakura; and an intimidating book of Japanese etiquette. The last was intimidating because it suggested so many ways that Western visitors could blunder and offend Japanese sensibilities, especially in homes. The greatest dangers involved shoes, handshakes, eating, and above all, bathing. The chances seemed overwhelming that I would make some egregious behavioral error that would type me as a Western barbarian. Our host families all had sons majoring in English at Keio University. But as we soon discovered, students of English in Japan learned the written language and often had no ability to speak English unless they had worked with private tutors. The son of my host family and I could barely communicate. He had come with his mother and younger brother with him. It was just smiles and hand gestures while we drank green tea. Then it was time to part with my fellow students and go home with my new family. They lived in Urawa City, a long commuter train ride from the center of Tokyo, followed by a long walk through shabby streets. Japan in 1959 had not yet begun to shine economically. My middle-class family lived in a modest, traditionally styled home with sliding paper screen doors and a mostly empty living room with tatami mats on the floor. The house was not heated, and the autumn chill came right through the thin walls. I am sure my fellow students were as anxious as I was about living in an alien culture and strange environment with people I did not know and who did not speak my language. I, however, had a more immediate and much more pressing concern. I desperately had to pee. In the hour since I had last visited a men's room, I had drunk a lot of green tea. I tried to smile and express interest in my Japanese hosts and their home, but the pressure in my bladder dominated my consciousness. In much distress, I drew the older son aside and tried to communicate with words and gestures that I had urgent need of a bathroom. After a few long minutes, he seemed to understand and led me down a hall to a sliding door that opened into a dark, wood-paneled room with a slatted wood floor. He motioned for me to go in and shut the door behind me. I looked around, bewildered, seeing nothing familiar and no obvious place to relieve myself. Several short wooden stools were placed against one wall, along with a few low wooden buckets. Steps led up to a platform in which was sunk what appeared to be a large covered barrel, also made of wood. In desperation, I picked up one of the wooden buckets and emptied my bladder into it, but relief was short-lived because I knew at once that I had done something terribly wrong. In fact, I was in the bathroom of the house. That is the place where Japanese clean and scrub themselves meticulously, sitting on a stool and using a cedar bucket to hold water to rinse with, before taking solo soaks in the ofuro, a wood-fired hot tub filled with near-scalding water. Japanese wisely separate the functions of bathing and elimination, making our Western bathrooms seem truly primitive. In 1959, Japanese toilets were primitive, sometimes mere holes in the floor in small rooms that stank. This was long before the advent of futuristic washlets that spray warm water and air on your lower parts, their lids opening and closing automatically as you approach or leave them. Some of these devices even talk to you and analyze your urine, which goes way beyond what I want from a toilet. But the bathroom in Japan has always been sacred space, kept scrupulously clean and governed by strict rules of conduct. Pissing into a washing bucket is an unthinkably gross breach of etiquette. I was aghast at the implications of what I had done, more so because I did not know how to dispose of the bucket of pee. I just stood there holding it, wishing I were anyplace else. My host must have been worried about me. Eventually, he knocked on the door and asked if I was okay. I opened the door, stared at him, then handed him the bucket. He looked confused, but took it from me and carried it down the hall. I left the bathroom, wanting to hide. Nothing was ever said about my barbarian act. I was shown the small toilet room, but I didn't remember much else about the afternoon. Maybe I took an extended nap. Before the evening meal, the son gave me a washing cloth and towel, took me back to the bathroom, and indicated that I should take a soak. I did remember the proper way to wash and rinse thoroughly before sliding into the ofuro, but I was totally unprepared for how hot the water was. As the honored guest, I was offered the first soak when the water was hottest. It took me many minutes to ease into the tub. Once in, I had to try not to move at all in order to avoid the sensation of being scalded. Even though I did not stay in long, my skin was quite red when I got out. In coming days, I learned to stay in long enough to soak up heat that kept me warm under the covers in my futon bed on the tatami-covered floor of an unheated room. I put on a cotton robe, a yukata, that was provided and went to the small room where the family ate. There I joined the two sons and met the father for the first time, a businessman who seemed stern and reserved. We sat on the floor around a low table while the mother brought dishes in from a tiny kitchen, knelt beside us, and served the men without eating herself. A small television set attached to a wall was showing an episode of an American Western, maybe Gunsmoke, with the volume turned low. The meal started with soup and continued through many courses, most of them strange, many delicious. There was little conversation, less that I understood. The mother kept urging me to eat more. When we finished, she cleared the table, and the two boys disappeared, leaving me alone with the father. I recalled the opening line of a chapter in The Japanese Are Like That. Quote, "From time immemorial, earthquake, thunder, fire, and father have been called the four major terrors of Japanese life," end quote. I could imagine that this particular father could inspire terror. The two of us faced each other in silence for a few minutes. Then he produced two small cups, placing one in front of me and the other close to him. Oh boy, I thought, I'm going to get to try sake. I had read about sake, but had never tasted it. I will tell you that I was a serious drinker at age 17, having first been drunk on bourbon at a high school class trip to New York, then falling into a pattern of excessive weekend drinking with friends that would continue through my college years until I discovered pot and lost all interest in using alcohol that way. At the time of this story, my tolerance for alcohol was high. Imagine my surprise and disappointment when father produced an unopened bottle of, not of rice wine, but of Johnny Walker Black Label Scotch, intended, I imagine, to honor the American guest. Now began a wordless ritual that would be repeated for the next half hour or so, repeated because I did not know how to make it stop. The father opened the bottle of whiskey, filled my cup, then his, set the bottle down, and raised his cup while looking at me. I imitated his actions. He bowed slightly toward me. I bowed toward him. Then he tossed back the scotch in one gulp. I did the same. He bowed again and set his cup down. I followed suit. After a brief silent interval, my host refilled my cup and his, and we went through it all again. On a subsequent trip to Japan, I learned that you can end this sort of relentless drinking by placing a hand palm down over your cup to indicate that you've had enough. Lacking information, I let the father fill and refill our cups until we had consumed about 2/3 of the bottle. By then, I was quite drunk, but still able to sit upright. The father, however, slumped over, then dragged himself out of the room. I managed to make it to my bed, where I sank into unconsciousness. Father was not at breakfast the next morning. I was served a wonderful meal of miso soup, steamed rice, a piece of broiled fish, cooked vegetables, pickled vegetables, and green tea, which agreed with me perfectly. I never liked American breakfast foods, not cereal, milk, eggs, pancakes, or other usual offerings. But that morning in Japan, I discovered what I did like, and I've sought out Japanese breakfast whenever I can find them. After eating, the older son took me by train to Keio University, where we both had classes. Some days later, I met another Keio student who spoke passable English and was able to help the son and me communicate. Through him, I learned that I had drunk the father under the table that night. He had been unable to go to work the next day, and as a result, I had earned his enormous respect. He was most polite to me throughout the rest of my stay. I have made many trips to Japan since 1959 and enjoy long-term friendships with many Japanese. On more than one occasion, I have reduced my friends to fits of laughter by recounting the misadventure of my first day in their country. The image of my handing the washing bucket of pee to my astonished host gets them every time.